We are talking about the word that everyone hates. Okay, there's lots of words people hate. I hate the word diet, but there's other words people hate. And this guy, Mr. Thomas, he embraces it and he is unconventional on purpose. So we're talking about emotions and disruption, the things most people run away from. So, Mr. Thomas, why have you embraced these two concepts? You got a big vision going on here, or are you just that kind of a guy who likes adventure?
I think it just came about somehow. I worked many years in crisis management and conflict management. That's kind of my background. And when I wrote my book a few years ago, I dove a bit into my experiences, and I looked a little bit on how I worked with crisis, different sorts of crisis, different types of conflicts, and these two things kept popping up. What makes a crisis so difficult is that it's actually disruption. So I stopped talking about crisis management. I talk more about disruption management, because that's what it really does to us. It disrupts. The other side is emotions, and emotions is throughout my career have been popping up on all levels, everywhere. It was in conflicts, of course, naturally the emotional charged. It was in conflict zones, in disaster zones. There was a lot of emotions involved. So it wasn't possible to navigate around them. Even for me, working with it wasn't possible. So that's why I have a very, very big passion about these two topics.
So you worked in war zones as a mediator, or did you have a role where you just had to mediate as an unfortunate side job, or could you tell me?
A little bit of both. So mediator is actually my background. So I am a professional mediator, but I worked in peace building and conflict resolution, the two fields that where I really started off. And I started off doing that in a high conflict zone. So first it was South Africa, which was a latent conflict, but later on it was Afghanistan. And there I worked. I didn't work with direct mediation. I didn't have that access to the population, and that was also not the aim. It was more showing the population their alternative dispute resolution methods, mechanisms, because they worked a lot with traditional conflict resolution, which is really they're horrible ways. We would actually just judge them as horrible. They're very traditional there, but they aren't particularly fair. They have a bad impact on particularly the female population. So that's kind of was the role. It was a trainer in the first place, and yeah.
Oh gosh. So tell me about you. I didn't tell you I was going to ask this question, but tell me about you as a kid. Were you like the middle child, or do you like conflict? Do you have that kind of a personality or do you just want peace and that's why you went into this kind of field?
No, I'm not a middle child. I'm actually, I was the first one. And I was for 8-9 years, I was with a single mom. And I had always that when adults would fight, which happens, I would be curious about it, but I didn't have the means and the tools to work with it. So I was very emotionally affected by it as well, because I felt a bit helpless. I didn't want them to fight, as many children don't want their parents to do, but I couldn't do anything with it. So I was in a way naturally drawn to that topic. And then later on, when I started studying, I studied political science. I kind of was a bit lost. It's that study that everybody does when they don't know what to do anything, what to do else. So and then I ended up in a training on negotiation, mediation, conflict transformation, and that's when I was hooked, and that's how the path went in the beginning.
And do you still have a deep curiosity for it now, and that's what drives you to do this kind of work as a facilitator, or do you get it now and now you're just like, less conflict in the world, better world?
I have a deep innate passion. I do think it's a natural part of our human existence, but we don't have the proper means, or we don't spend enough time to actually really look at why is this important to deal with it. What's the potential of a conflict? We let it escalate rather than work with it constructively. We also put lids on it in terms of we try to manage it, but there's not so much to manage. It's really, you have to work with it. You have to go into a transformational aspect, and you have to really look at what's the origin, where do the emotions come from, back to our topic in a way. What do they want to tell us, and how can we work with that?
As a simpleton, does most conflict come from fear? It's
Yeah,
Not,
well,
not that simple.
I mean, yes, fear is always a part, but fear is more a reaction to maybe the conflict than an original. Let's say like root cause is not really the right type anymore, because the research has moved on to more systemic understanding of conflicts. It's not like really there's an origin and a cause and then there's an effect. It's more that there's lots of factors that influence each other, and that keeps the system going. So fear is one of them. It's what's often called the catalyst. So fear, for example, is also, ironically, fear is often what keeps us in a conflict, because the fear of the alternative is often bigger than the fear of the known, right? So it's the fear of the unknown versus the fear of the known, and that's what often keeps us in a conflict. So fear is there, but fear is not always like where it starts. It often starts with, for example, autonomy in the sense of that I want to have a space where I can decide over myself, where I can make independent decisions. And often through just words and behaviors, we step over those invisible lines. And we don't know that my autonomy was hurt by whatever you did, for example. So I react very emotionally to it. And the other side to it is that we are interdependent. We need each other. So it's quite of a paradox. You have autonomy and you need the autonomy, but you also need to be connected somehow. And in that sphere, often the conflict plays out.
It's like every teenager's conflict, right?
Teenagers are a very a perfect example of how emotions and conflicts and their own like space play into each other.
So there's this, as a facilitator, we have these kind of talks of, I guess, how to. Well, I'm going to get straight into it. I'm like on a rampage. I don't know, on a mission that I want to get people in the room talking that usually don't get the space to talk. And so as I create this, as I co-create, as I create the people that I want to come talk at this conference in Barcelona, this unconference, I want to make sure that people are seen and heard. And so when people don't feel seen and heard in a situation, we tend to feel like I'm not in control, I'm not welcome here, my voice doesn't matter. And that tends to brew up inside of people, and they stop listening, because why are they even invited to this meeting anyway, if only the old like loud guy gets to talk? And in general, it's the loudest person who gets to talk the most. But then they don't say anything. And I wonder, because you talk a lot, because this is your field, on LinkedIn about facilitation, you have a great following. I really enjoy seeing what you post. What can you tell me about how us facilitators include and address the injustices, the lack of opportunity of some participants in the room? How do you mediate that kind of emotion without creating a conflict where the big guy in charge is like, well, I have opinions and I'm the boss, so I'm allowed to talk? I know it's not 100% related, but for me, that's super interesting with our IAF background.
Well, there's of course different answers depending on the context, but something that always works, or always, but let's say very often works for me, is I notice that these insecurities, this lack of participation, come from existing power dynamics, and we will not be able to remove those power dynamics. But one approach that I like to take is called leveling the playing field. So it's basically taking them out of their everyday constellations, their everyday roles, their everyday functions, and put them in a situation they're completely unfamiliar with, but all of them. So in a way that they have to, like, they're confronted with something that distracts them from, okay, who am I in this group, and do I even belong, and do I have a voice, and those questions, and they just focus on, okay, we're not familiar with this, and that the beautiful effect about this is brings the group closer together, because they're confronted with something they don't know. And that's when we tend to see connections, and we actually overcome these power dynamics very often, in the sense of that we have a common experience here that we don't know, that's unknown for us. We have to deal with it. Let's just see how this plays out. And because of the distraction, the surprise, the mind goes a bit away from my own insecurities and works in a collective. And then the moment they are attentive, the moment they're in a collective, you already have them at a different space. And what I like to do is also to work with smaller groups. I know we talk a lot about psychological safety, but I think from a certain group size, it becomes almost a bit of a paradox to aim for psychological safety amongst everybody in the room. I think that costs more energy than if you start with smaller groups and build up this safety. Because if I feel more comfortable with 3 people, chances that I feel more comfortable because I have already 2 connections in a bigger group is way higher. So that's the two of the things that I usually apply.
So I'm hearing do, not talk.
Yes.
Get them in smaller groups, distract them from their normal insecure bubble, and pop that and put them into a place. And that's why you tell people that you are intentionally unconventional. And so the conventionality in a system that is, well, I call it corrupt, racist, and classist and privileged, people get to speak more. If you pop that, your intentionality is the exact key to the success of what's going to change. And very few people do that because they're too scared to be unconventional. And have you had a lot of like, that's too crazy for us energy, or do you start slowly when you enter with your unconventionality?
I usually start immediately with a surprise. So even when they enter the room looks very unconventional sometimes. They don't know where to sit. But what's very important is everybody knows. So because I set it up like, for example, there could be 2 circles facing each other, for example, right?
Yeah.
And then it's like, and people would stand because nobody wants to be the first one to sit down. I'm like, well, take a seat. But everybody's in the same situation. And what I also do, and you just reminded me of something what's very important, is I usually I like to take away some of the means that feed into these power dynamics. So for example, language, right? I sometimes I take away the ability, put a constraint on you, you're not allowed to speak.
What? You do that?
Because you immediately are focused on something else, right? You're like, okay, I have to communicate, but you cannot use words as power. You cannot use like the way you usually communicate with body language and all those things. You have to communicate differently. And I face sometimes resistance, but usually the group takes care of itself, because the moment people participate, nobody wants to miss out. Because it's equally difficult to be the first one to say like, I don't think we should do this, as it is the first one to sit down in those circles. So I play a lot on those group dynamics. And what I'm also very, very aware of is like, whose convention am I breaking here? Is it my convention, or is it the expectations that I know, for example, participants have when they come into a room? So they know they can sit down, there might be a circle, or there might be a desk, or is it like they have an image on how this room looks, and if they don't have, they're immediately out. The convention is gone. This is new. And new means attention. New means more focus, a little bit of adrenaline, distraction, all those things, they play into that.
So in your opinion, convention is, I don't know, could you finish that sentence for me?
Convention is a mental model that we have about a certain situation, a context, an interaction, any given topic. It's basically something that we've always been doing. And one example that I always bring is one of my conventions was that you don't wear a hat at the dinner table, right? That was my dad was very insistent on that. Take off the hat, you don't wear the hat on the dinner table. When I started working abroad and I went to South Africa, we had dinner with a group in a small village, and then this young boy comes and he was wearing a cap. And all my inner voices were like, what the hell is going on here? You can't do that. I was about to stand up, like, I have to take off the hat. And it was really a challenge for me, because this was my convention. My convention was like, this is what you do at a dinner table. But that wasn't a convention everywhere. So in terms of like, his behavior broke with my convention.
Gotcha.
And this is what convention is for me, right? It's something that we're used to, something that we think has to be that way, and that we have an emotional reaction to when it's not that way.
Forgive me for this, but how is that related to values?
Can be related to values, but doesn't have to be. Because values for me, and I recently wrote about this, is very tricky, because values are always umbrella terms. Like recently, I asked people to in a post to answer for me the question what respect is for them in just one sentence. And there was a lot of different replies, and yet we often work with within this group or within this team, one of our values is respect, but we never take the time to actually go a level deeper and say like, so what do we understand is respect? And the second question is like, how does behavior look? Because all our values are somehow they originate, or they're rooted in behaviors that taught us like, okay, this is important for me. And that behavior we hardly ever go to or explain to someone else why we think that's the case. Like going back to the example with the hat, like I felt this was disrespectful not to have it on to have a hat on the table. But at the same time, this was something I was taught. This behavior that I was trained and taught in my childhood. So I took it over. I never questioned that. Never took that as, is there actually another perspective on it? And only like when I was confronted with it and I felt I have an emotional reaction to it, I knew, okay, this goes deep. This is a trigger, but it really it led me to also explore why. And when we go into a conversation like me and that boy, I can explain, like, when I was raised, my father was very insistent that this is, a value of politeness, and he might understand. I'm not asking him to change anything, but it's also not about agreeing. It's about understanding, like why I might react, for example.
Okay, so back to the mediating thing, because most of us, well, whenever I ask people in my workshops about their least strong emotional intelligence ability, 90% of people with conflict management. Because where the hell did we learn it from? From our fighting parents? Like, okay, my parents didn't fight, so I also didn't learn how to fight really well either. So I had very little of that. I had to learn it in life. And that's really interesting, because you don't have to agree, you just have to understand. Because how are you going to solve these conflicts that you were working with in Afghanistan and South Africa? They're not going to agree, but they have to understand each other. So some of the tools, do you have like a practical, like, habit, like questions that you ask when you're going into a conflict, when you are intending to disrupt?
The simplest question is like, what, for example, what is the opposite of a conflict for you? And people come with very different answers, right? So often we go and look at define conflict and stuff. This was the very traditional approach, was always like, what is conflict in one word for you? But if you flip it over and say, like, so what is the opposite of conflict? Then you will find out what people are striving towards. That's what they're missing. That's what they're actually, they want out of this situation. And by that, you already create an understanding, okay, we need different things from this. So it's all about like creating a space where people start sharing differences. And conflicts are always, the ironic thing of conflict is that very often the disagreements are almost always the disagreements on a factual level and partly on an interest level. But when it goes deeper, like the need, what do we want out of this? You also hear very similar things: safety, stability, calm, autonomy. So those things. And then when people realize we actually want the same thing, but we look at it from different angles, that's when you can start working. Because then there's an understanding there, even though we might not define stability the same way. It's what we strive for. So we have that in common. It's just something that we look upon differently.
But in a simpler way, isn't that what humans want? They want autonomy. They have fear of pain, fear of loss. Like, if we look at the fears, it's just the context that it's in. So are most of the processes of dealing with conflict very, I don't want to say textbook, but the theory is there, and then you just have to work through it with the humans and their level of cooperation and ability to express themselves? Or is every case so original?
Every case is original, because we are also, because textbook you can work with this, and there's the mediation approach, and then there's the systemic conflict analysis approach, and you have lots of different approaches to it. And they all have their benefits, and they all have their disadvantages, because they work, it's cultural context, etc. But what is very important, for example, is to flip over what you've just said, right? So there might be fear of this and fear of that and fear of that, but flip it over. Because if you flip it over, it's like, so what is it that they want? What is it that they're striving towards? And that's when it's a completely different lens to look upon a conflict. Because we can stay into that. We're all afraid, and we're and the negative emotions. But if you flip it over, you actually go into the potential, you go into the opportunities, you go into a very different mindset for it. Conflict really, and this is completely underestimated, conflict is a lot language and communication. So it's a lot of like how we express ourselves. And this is where mediators often come in, right? Because as a mediator, the role is a very large part of my role is to help people articulate themselves. So not speak for them, but to help them find words. And one of the things that stuck with me from my training is that we were challenged on finding emotional or terms that express emotions, right? And we came up with, on average, 10 to maybe 12. Some had even maybe 13, but that was it. And then we were given a list of 50 different words that could express emotions. And that is complete. And then we see so how limited our language often is, right? And as mediators, this is a bit the task, help people find the nuances in their expressions, because the more they feel seen, the more, back to what you've said before, they're willing to share and contribute, and they feel like, okay, I have a voice here because I'm acknowledged. That's often all it takes.
So giving a voice to people is part of your work, giving the right words. Oh my gosh.
Don't worry about it.
Because we're getting close to it, so I have the alarm going on, but I want to ask this question. My work is a lot in getting women a voice so that they get heard in a room, let's say, in a meeting. And so for us as women, it's talking more assertively. It's expressing ourselves with confidence and learning how to interrupt. So those are kind of the things that we have to learn who are raised in the Western culture. And so I just wonder, that's not the solution to conflict. It's like getting your voice heard in different content. Sorry, I'm just talking out loud here. It's very interesting that you need the words to express what you want, but both sides need to understand what the words mean from different cultures. So it's very, I don't know, do you use the concept of NLP? Is this, have you studied that?
I didn't study that. I'm familiar with it, but I think there's again, as with lots of concepts, there's positive things to that as well. But it's interesting what you say about women. I had recently a leadership training, and it ended up for Women's Association. So there were 38 women there, and I was not in the space to give them a voice. They needed to find their own voice. So this whole training was about making them understand that everything starts and ends with them, right? So I created these spaces where I wasn't even part of. So I created these spaces where they were amongst each other, and I gave them tasks which I knew were challenging enough, which is just, for example, simply standing up and telling, like, in a very short time, 2 minutes, like why anybody should be led by them, to 6 other women, and then just in their own words, and then get fed back the external perspective on what values did people hear from that short pitch, what qualities, what skills, so that you basically get an external and internal perspective. And this is for me where it starts, right? You need to look in the mirror and say, like, I have actually that voice, and then how is this reached? What do people hear? And that I did in that small circle. I didn't hear any of those pitches because it wasn't my space. I did particularly not want to be there, because this is an empowerment that I don't want to give. I don't want to kind of feed into that what I already represent visually, right? The white middle-aged man from a Western country. So it was just really like, all I did was creating a space where they can try to find their voice. This is as far as I went, and they said it was extremely challenging, even in that small circle. This just confirms what you said, like how deeply this sits. But they also said, like, once it's done, once we went through the discomfort, it was incredibly empowering. It's like I took that space, I went into it, so I have a voice, right? And of course, that's just the first step of many, but at least it's the first step.
I've never really thought that word empowerment, that you didn't want to own that word or have that role because of what you are. And because if I say I'm doing women empowerment and I'm a female, it makes sense. But you giving power to women, instead you created a space. That's for me. And I guess I had just never thought that we give power to people, or we give them the tools for power. And so managing that kind of energy in a facilitation space, when you have some conflict with someone who also wants power in the room, and you're giving and taking, and you get to control as a facilitator who speaks and who doesn't speak. And it's such a fine balance of mediation for the louder people, the more reserved people, the people with less privilege, less voice, who maybe were hardly even invited to sit there. And actually the meta conversation about that. Do you ever, last question, do you ever like call that out? Like, wow, there's a lot of white people in this room. What's with our diversity? Why is that person not on the agenda? Or like, do you
I don't, because I know that this is a wasp's nest for me, right? Because I open up something that I can't close.
Gotcha.
But I just, through my behavior, say, like, I try to model, like, this is not something I live, right? And what I often do is maybe that's also a small tip, is I put the very loud people together in a group and the others together in a group. And that's always very interesting dynamics, right? Because when you have a lot of loud people, then that what becomes of the group? Like, somebody will have to step back, and how does it feel then, right? So it's just really getting like a bit into those dynamics. And
you ask them?
What I also like to do is smaller. Sorry?
You ask them?
I ask. We do different. I do different forms of debriefs, but that's, for example, something I approach is how did it feel like to be, challenged? So how did you feel your voice was heard in that group and stuff? And that's when there often is a realization, like, well, I didn't really get a word in because others were talking so much. It's like, and then you see, oh yeah, okay, here's you see how something started working, and that's already a great step.
And you just kind of smile, or you go, aha, that's you and every other group,
I don't
brother.
do that. I'm like, okay, but so what I pointed out was it was difficult. So I basically just mirror it back so that it's then underlined,
Okay.
and then I just play on other experiences, opposite
Gotcha.
experience, whatever. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, it was a mix of just my curiosity about what you do, because you have such an interesting background and working in conflict zones. If anyone knows how to mediate and facilitate, it would be someone who has worked in those difficult situations, not just la corporate land, get chocolate cake for lunchtime, which is what I've only worked in. So I was really
Also
looking
challenging there. It's so don't underestimate that.
Wow, that's kind of you. Thank you. Thank you for it. Was short notice, and I wanted to get you into the agenda before I go away for next week to get more people interested in facilitation. Our conference is called an unconference,
It's
and we're
amazing.
trying
I'm
to.
sorry I can't be part of this year, but it's
you are a
sounds
part of it.
fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
One
this.
day in the future. Thank you very much, Thomas. Bye.
Bye.